Imagine dedicating your entire life to fighting like this monstrous system of exploitation.
Right.
You spend decades meticulously mapping out its every weakness. You're writing volumes on how it operates, how it extracts wealth, and, how to organize an army to defeat it.
The whole playbook.
Exactly. You are standing on the battlefield, your sword is drawn, you are pointing at the beast, and then an ancient philosopher just sits down next to you on the grass.
Oh, man.
He looks at your maps, looks at the monster, and mathematically just relentlessly proves that the monster, the battlefield, the sword, and like even you do not actually exist.
It is the ultimate intellectual rug pull. I mean, you are geared up for a physical, structural revolution, and suddenly the very dimension of reality you're trying to revolutionize just dissolves.
Welcome to this deep dive. And this one is curated specifically for you, the listener. Today, our mission is to take two monumental, world-altering ways of understanding reality and just smash them together at high speed.
Yeah, we are looking for the ultimate philosophical collision here.
Right. Because on one side, we have the incredibly dense, structurally rigid, materialist worldview of Karl Marx.
And on the other, the profound, like reality-dissolving metaphysics of the 2nd century Buddhist philosopher Nāgārjuna.
And we are pulling from the absolute bedrock texts of both thinkers for this. For Marx, we are looking at Capital, specifically Volume 1, his economic and philosophic manuscripts of 1844, and the German ideology.
Yeah, and those are the documents that literally shaped the modern political and economic world. I mean, they argue with ferocious detail that reality is built on material economic structures.
And then for Nāgārjuna, who is the founder of the Madhyamaka, or Middle Way, school of Mahayana Buddhism, we are diving into the Mūlamadhyamakakārikā.
Right, which translates to the fundamental verses on the middle way.
Yes, exactly. We're also pulling from the Shunyatratati, the 70 stanzas on emptiness, and the Vigrahavyavartani, which is the dispeller of disputes.
The stakes here are just fascinating because this isn't just, a disagreement about how society should be run.
No, not at all.
It's a clash where the very dimension of how we perceive existence is completely misaligned. It's an ontological earthquake.
It really is. Now, before we jump into that earthquake, just a quick note for you listening. We are examining these texts purely as philosophical and historical documents.
Right, context is key.
Exactly. Marx's writings obviously contain heavily politically charged concepts, revolution, class struggle, anti-capitalism. We are not endorsing, taking sides on, or advocating for any of these political viewpoints.
And we aren't taking a religious stance on Buddhism either.
No. We are acting as neutral guides, just conveying and analyzing the ideas contained in the original source material. Our goal is to see what happens to our understanding of the world when we force these two radically different frameworks to occupy the same space.
And to do that, we really have to start at the absolute foundation. I mean, if you were going to build a worldview, you have to establish what is real.
What actually exists out there in the universe.
Right, exactly. And when Marx looks out at the world, specifically the capitalist world of the 19th century, he doesn't start with abstract daydreams.
No, he starts with something you can drop on your foot.
He really does. He begins Capital, Volume 1, Chapter 1, with the commodity.
The commodity.
Right, it is the elemental building block of the capitalist system. For Marx, the world is constructed of real, material relations, and the commodity is the physical manifestation of those relations.
He famously uses the examples of a coat and a yard of linen, physical, tangible stuff, and he breaks down the reality of these objects into two distinct categories.
First, he talks about use value.
Right, and use value is pretty simple. It is the physical utility of the object. A coat keeps you warm, a cup holds water.
Exactly. The use value is tied entirely to the physical properties of the material. But Marx says that in a capitalist system, commodities have a second, much more complex reality.
And that is exchange value.
Yes. And this is where Marx makes a massive claim about what is real. When you trade one coat for 20 yards of linen, you aren't trading warmth for fabric.
Right. You are trading them based on an invisible but entirely real substance they both contain.
That substance is crystallized, abstract human labor. Marx argues that the exchange value of a commodity is determined by the socially necessary labor time required to produce it.
So it's not just a neat accounting trick.
No, not at all. For Marx, this value is a socially real, objective fact.
Yep.
He says it possesses a phantom-like objectivity.
Wow. Phantom-like objectivity.
Yeah. It is an invisible force generated by human sweat and time that becomes trapped inside the commodity.
So if I'm tracking this, Marx is saying that the labor frozen in that coat is an undeniable reality. Value isn't just an opinion.
No, it is a structural force. It governs human lives with the absolute crushing weight of a natural law, almost like gravity.
So the capitalist system objectively exists out there, dictating how we live, work, and survive.
The material world, the economy, the physical commodities, and the labor required to make them, these are the bedrock. They are the fixed entities from which all other human experiences emerge.
Okay, so that's the fortress Marx has built. Now we pivot to Nāgārjuna. We open the Mūlamadhyamakakārikā, right, to chapter 1.
Chapter 1, yeah.
And Nāgārjuna looks at this incredibly solid, heavily structured material world Marx just built, and he introduces a concept that threatens to just vaporize the whole thing.
And that concept is shunyata, emptiness.
But we need to be incredibly careful with this translation, right? Because emptiness in Western context usually implies a void or a vacuum.
Or nihilism.
Yeah.
It sounds like Nāgārjuna saying nothing exists, which would make him a simple nihilist.
But the texts are very clear that shunyata is not non-existence.
Right. The more accurate Sanskrit term the texts rely on is nisvabhavata, which translates to the lack of any fixed, independent essence or inherent nature.
So Nāgārjuna is not saying the coat doesn't appear to exist.
Exactly. He's saying the coat lacks coatness. It has no independent self-sustaining core that makes it a coat.
Let me try to apply that to our clash here. Marx is standing there holding the coat saying, the value in this commodity is real. The labor is real.
And Nāgārjuna is pointing out the very premise of saying the coat inherently is anything at all is a cognitive error.
Because it's a made-up boundary.
Right. Nāgārjuna argues that absolutely everything exists only interdependently. A coat only exists in dependence on its parts, the fabric, the thread, the buttons.
And it exists in dependence on its causes, right?
Yeah.
The lever, the loom, the sheep that provided the wool.
Yes, and crucially, it exists in dependence on the mind that conceptualizes it and slaps the label coat onto that specific arrangement of atoms.
I want to use an analogy here for you listening to really visualize this clash. Think about looking up at the night sky and pointing out a constellation. Let's say Orion.
I love this analogy.
Right, so Marx is standing next to you, brilliantly analyzing the exact gravitational forces between those specific stars, their chemical composition, how they interact as a real material thermodynamic system.
He's plotting the objective data.
Exactly. Then Nāgārjuna taps you on the shoulder and says, you realize the lines connecting those stars aren't actually there, right? You drew them in your head.
That captures the dynamic beautifully. Marx is meticulously analyzing the behavior of the system, assuming the system has an inherent objective reality.
He assumes the constellation is a real thing.
Yeah. Nāgārjuna is deconstructing the conceptual framework that allows you to perceive the constellation as a distinct entity in the first place. He is pointing out that the boundaries we draw around objects are conceptual overlays.
But Nāgārjuna goes even further than just pointing out conceptual boundaries, doesn't he? I mean, he attacks the very structure of human logic and language to prove his point.
He does. He is ruthless with logic. Nāgārjuna employs a relentless logical tool called the katukku, or the tetralemma.
The tetralemma.
Yeah, it's a four-cornered system of logical analysis. If you claim something has an inherent independent essence, Nāgārjuna forces you to defend it against four possibilities.
Okay, what are they?
Does it exist? Does it not exist? Does it both exist and not exist? Or does it neither exist nor not exist?
Honestly, that sounds like a riddle designed to give you a headache.
It is designed to break your reliance on conventional language. Let's apply it to Marx's concept of value.
Okay, let's do it.
Marx says value inherently exists inside the commodity. Nāgārjuna would ask, if value inherently exists, is it independent of the coat?
Well, if it is independent, then value should exist floating in the air without a coat. But it doesn't.
Right, so value doesn't exist independently. Then you move to the second corner. Does value not exist?
Well, clearly something is happening when people trade coats for linen, so total non-existence is false.
Exactly. Does it both exist and not exist?
Yeah.
That's a logical contradiction.
Right, and does it neither exist nor not exist? That's just incoherent.
So by exhausting every logical possibility, Nāgārjuna proves that value cannot be an independent, self-sustaining substance.
Wow.
It is entirely dependent on conditions, agreements, human minds, and physical materials. It is empty.
The implications for Marx's life's work are staggering here. Marx believes he is critiquing an absolute, independent, monstrous entity called capitalism.
And Nāgārjuna demonstrates that capitalism has no inherent essence. It is a temporary, highly unstable web of causes, conditions, and conceptual designations.
Which means the very foundation of Marx's reality, the bedrock he is standing on to launch his critique, is suddenly entirely fluid.
Completely fluid, the target of his critique vanishes.
Right. So if the foundation is empty, what happens to the heavy structural pillars Marx builds on top of it? And I'm talking about capital, labor, and class.
To see how those pillars hold up, we need to look at Marx's economic and philosophic manuscripts of 1844.
Okay.
Marx defines capital not just as money, but as accumulated, stored-up human labor that has taken on a life of its own.
In his later writings, he literally compares it to a vampire.
Yes, it is dead labor that only lives by sucking living labor, and lives the more labor it sucks.
It's such a terrifying, vivid image. Capital is this autonomous, dominating force, and the blood it feeds on is labor.
Right, because for Marx, labor isn't just a job you clock into. It is the defining characteristic of the human species. He calls it our species being.
Through labor, humans interact with nature, transform it, and in doing so, realize their own potential.
But under capitalism, Marx argues, the worker is violently alienated from this process. They don't own the product they make. They don't control the process of making it.
So they are alienated from their own human nature.
And they are alienated from their fellow workers, who become competitors. The more commodities the worker produces, the cheaper a commodity the worker becomes.
They are stripped of their humanity and turned into a biological cog in an industrial machine.
Which creates the third pillar, class. You have the capitalists, who own the means of production, the factories, the land, the machines.
And you have the proletariat, the workers, who have absolutely nothing to sell but their physical ability to work.
For Marx, this class divide is an objective, undeniable reality. It is an absolute conflict built into the geometry of the system.
The capitalist and the worker are locked in a cage match, and the cage is made of iron.
That is the Marxist view, yes.
But let's bring the dispeller of disputes, Nāgārjuna, into this 19th century factory. How does Madhyamaka philosophy process these massive, heavy categories?
Well, Nāgārjuna classifies them as prajñapti.
Prajapti, which translates to what?
It translates to provisional names or mere designations. He takes a philosophical sledgehammer to the idea that capital, labor, or class have any inherent standalone reality.
Let's run them through the Mūlamadhyamaka machine then. How does capital just vanish?
Capital is just a word we use when a nearly infinite, incredibly complex web of conditions momentarily align.
What kind of conditions?
It requires laws, courts to enforce private property, historical enclosures of land, technological developments, human desires, printed paper, digital ledgers.
So there is no independent capital essence hovering inside a bank vault.
Exactly. If you remove any of those dependent conditions, the capital disappears. It is a conceptual shorthand, not a real entity.
Okay, but what about labor? I mean, Marx grounds his entire anthropology in the act of working. If capital is just a provisional name, what happens to the worker?
This is where Nāgārjuna strikes at the very core of Western philosophy. In Chapter 18 of the MMK, which deals with the self and entities, Nāgārjuna systematically refutes the existence of an independent self, or Atman.
Wait, he refutes the self?
Yes. He argues that what we call the self is just a temporary grouping of physical and mental aggregates: form, feeling, perception, mental formations, and consciousness.
Hold on. If there is no inherent self, then there is no fixed subject. There is no enduring I who is performing the labor.
That is the Madhyamaka conclusion. Labor is just a fleeting sequence of interdependent actions, and the worker is a provisional label applied to a temporary collection of physical and mental phenomena.
So from Nāgārjuna's perspective, the alienation Marx describes is fundamentally misdiagnosed.
Completely misdiagnosed. Because Marx says the worker is suffering because capitalism separates them from their true nature.
Right, and Nāgārjuna would counter that the suffering doesn't come from being separated from your true nature.
The suffering comes from the delusion that you have a fixed, inherent nature to begin with.
Oh, wow.
The worker is alienated because they are grasping at an illusion of a permanent self and feeling pain when that illusion is subjected to the harsh, changing conditions of the world. The root of the misery is ontological ignorance, not just economic exploitation.
That is a staggering pivot. Marx says the system is breaking your true self, and Nāgārjuna says your belief in a true self is what the system is using to break you.
And that completely dissolves the third pillar, class. You cannot have a capitalist without a worker. They mutually co-arise.
Right. The identity of the capitalist is entirely dependent on the existence of the worker who sells their labor.
Because they depend entirely on each other to exist, neither has an independent, standalone reality. They are empty of inherent nature.
But, I have to push back here on behalf of the listener, because there is a very real danger of this sounding like philosophical gaslighting.
How do you mean?
Well, it's easy for a philosopher in a monastery to say class is just a provisional name. But if you are the 19th century factory worker Marx interviewed, someone doing a grueling 14-hour shift in a textile mill, breathing in cotton dust, watching your children starve while the factory owner builds a mansion,
Yeah.
that provisional name feels like physical violence. Telling that worker your class identity is empty feels dismissive of real, agonizing suffering.
That is the essential, brilliant friction of this deep dive. How do we reconcile the ultimate philosophical truth of emptiness with the undeniable, visceral reality of human suffering?
Let's upgrade our video game analogy to get at this. Marx is writing the ultimate strategy guide for a brutally difficult video game.
Okay, I'm with you.
He is analyzing the final boss, let's call the boss capitalism. Marx maps out its attack patterns, its hit points, the environment you're fighting in. He says, here's the material reality of the game. Here's the exact sequence of buttons you need to press to win.
And Nāgārjuna is sitting next to you on the couch.
Yes, and Nāgārjuna is pointing out that the boss isn't real. It's just pixels.
But it's more than just pixels, right? The boss only exists because of the code running on a console, the electricity powering the screen, the specific rules programmed by the developers.
And crucially, your mind interpreting those flashing lights as a threatening monster.
Exactly. If you pull the plug or delete the code, the boss vanishes. It has no independent existence inside your television.
But, and this is to your point about the suffering factory worker, Nāgārjuna, isn't denying that within the context of the game, if you just stand there and let the boss hit you, your character's health bar will drop to 0.
Right. Recognizing that the monster is made of dependent conditions like code, electricity, perception, doesn't automatically stop the game from functioning.
So Marx is teaching you how to survive the mechanics of the game, while Nāgārjuna is trying to show you the nature of the software.
That's a perfect way to put it.
Which brings us to a massive question. How does the software actually run? How does the boss deal damage? How do things actually happen in the world? How does A lead to B?
We are entering the territory of causality, the mechanics of reality. This is where the collision gets truly profound, because both Marx and Nāgārjuna have intensely developed theories on cause and effect.
Let's look at Marx's engine of causality, which he outlines in the German ideology.
Yeah, let's go there.
Marx operates on a system of strict historical materialism. He writes one of the most famous sentences in philosophy. It is not consciousness that determines life, but life that determines consciousness.
This is the foundation of his base and superstructure model. Marx argues that the economic forces of production, how we farm, how we manufacture, who owns the land and the machines, strictly determines the superstructure.
And the superstructure is everything else in society, right? Our laws, our religion, our art, our morality, our philosophy.
Yes. Marx says you don't invent a legal system out of thin air. You invent a legal system that specifically protects the economic base.
So if the base relies on private property, the superstructure will generate laws making theft illegal and religions that praise hard work.
The causality here is forceful, linear, and real. The material economy prescribes the culture. A causes B. The arrow of determination points definitively from the material to the ideological.
Now let's open chapter 20 of Nāgārjuna's MMK, which is just a relentless, punishing examination of cause and effect.
It really is. Nāgārjuna's view of causality is known as pratyecsamutpada, or dependent origination. And here's where he delivers a devastating blow to Marx's entire structural model.
How does he break the model?
Well, Marx relies entirely on the grammar of determining. The base determines the superstructure. The cause forces the effect. Nāgārjuna invalidates the very grammar of that relationship.
Grammar of determining is an error.
Yeah. He asks a simple, brutal, logical question that we have to walk through slowly.
Yeah.
Does the effect already exist inherently within the cause or not?
Okay, let's test that. Let's say a seed is the cause and a sprout is the effect. Does the sprout already exist inside the seed?
If the sprout already exists perfectly and entirely inside the seed, possessing its own inherent nature, then it doesn't need to be produced. It is already there.
Right. And if it's already there, the concept of causation is completely redundant. You can't cause something that already exists.
Exactly.
But obviously the sprout isn't fully formed inside the seed. A seed is a hard little pebble. A sprout is a green leafy thing. They are different. It has to grow.
Okay, so take the second option. If the effect does not exist in the cause at all, if the sprout is entirely separate and independent from the seed, then how can that specific cause produce that specific effect?
I'm not sure I follow.
If cause A and effect B are entirely independent, inherently existing entities with no overlap, a seed could just as easily produce a rock, or a cloud, or a teacup.
Oh, I see the trap. If they're exactly the same, nothing happens. If they are totally different, there's no connection between them. So how do we explain things changing?
Let's try another analogy.
Let me try the classic physics analogy. I set up a line of dominoes. I won't over-explain it. We all know how kinetic energy works. Domino A falls, strikes domino B, and forces it to fall. That is a real deterministic event. A causes B.
So how does Nāgārjuna look at those falling dominoes?
Yeah, what does he say?
Nāgārjuna looks at your dominoes and points out that domino A, domino B, and the act of striking are all empty concepts. None of them independently exist to perform an action.
Wait, I can hold the domino in my hand. It exists. I can feel it.
Thus, the domino A is only a cause in relation to domino B.
Yeah.
You take domino B away, domino A is just a piece of plastic falling on a table. It ceases to be a cause.
So its identity as a cause depends on the effect.
Therefore, its identity as a cause is entirely dependent on the effect. Yes.
That feels totally backwards.
It feels backwards to our conventional minds, but logically it's undeniable. You cannot be a father until you have a child. The cause, the father, only comes into existence simultaneously with the effect, the child.
Oh, wow.
Furthermore, if domino A had an inherent, unchanging nature of being a cause, it would be frozen in a state of causing forever. It would never stop falling.
But it does stop.
It only acts as a cause under a massive, infinite web of temporary conditions. The gravity of the earth, the friction of the table, the specific distance between the dominoes, the air pressure, the person who flicked it.
So because everything is mutually dependent, you can never isolate a single cause A that independently, on its own power, forces effect B.
Exactly. You cannot draw a neat, straight arrow from one thing to another. Causality is not a line of dominoes. It is an infinitely vast, vibrating web where every single node is leaning on every other node.
So when we apply that back to Marx, the structural damage is catastrophic. The idea that the economic base independently determines the cultural superstructure just falls apart.
The relationship of determining is empty.
The base and the superstructure co-arise.
They are mutually dependent.
Yeah.
You cannot have the capitalist mode of production, the base, without the legal concept of private property.
Yeah.
The superstructure already existing to define what capital is.
They lean on each other like sheaves of reeds. If you pull one away, the other falls.
Neither can determine the other in a linear, independent way.
This raises a massive question, though. If we lose linear cause and effect, if we lose the ability to say, this material condition specifically caused this social outcome, do we lose the ability to explain why the world is the way it is?
That's a great question.
Does Nāgārjuna leave us in a chaotic universe where we can't analyze society?
Nāgārjuna would argue that we actually understand the world better through dependent origination, because we're no longer trapped by the illusion of simple reductionist causes.
We see the infinite dynamic web of conditions.
We see how fragile the system actually is,
Yeah.
but you are right. It completely breaks Marx's specific engine.
And if that engine breaks, the vehicle it's powering crashes.
And that vehicle is human history.
Which brings us to the next profound collision. Because if cause and effect fall apart, the entire timeline of human existence, which relies on a sequence of causes leading to a specific future, must also face the chopping block.
Marx's view of history is epic in scale. It is highly teleological.
Meaning it is moving toward a specific destined endpoint.
Yes. In texts like The German Ideology and the Communist Manifesto, Marx looks at human history and sees a continuous forward progression of material modes of production.
He maps it out in distinct, inevitable stages. Primitive communism inevitably develops into slave societies. Slave societies inevitably generate the contradictions that lead to feudalism. Feudalism gives birth to capitalism.
And crucially, capitalism is not the end. Capitalism generates its own internal contradictions. It creates the very proletariat that will overthrow it.
Which leads inevitably to socialism and finally the resolution of all class conflict in pure communism.
So history is a real, forward-moving timeline, pushing toward a future resolution. It has a destination.
Now let's open chapter 19 of Nāgārjuna's MMK, which is entirely dedicated to the concept of time.
And Nāgārjuna argues that time itself is empty. The past, the present, and the future do not exist as independent, real entities.
This is one of the most counterintuitive arguments in the text, so we have to trace his logic carefully. carefully.
He uses that same ruthless method of analyzing dependence. He asks, do the present and the future depend on the past?
Well, obviously, today depends on yesterday. Tomorrow depends on today. The capitalist present depends on the feudal past.
Right. But Nāgārjuna points out a semantic and logical paradox. If the present and future truly depended on the past, they would have to exist within the past.
Wait, why?
Because if they didn't exist in the past, how could the past act upon them to bring them about? You can't have a relationship with something that doesn't exist.
Oh.
If the present is completely non-existent during the past has nothing to connect to. It's like trying to tie a rope to a boat that hasn't been built yet.
Okay, my brain is starting to melt a little here. Let me try the other side. What if the present and future do not depend on the past?
Well, if the present doesn't depend on the past, then it is completely unmoored. It wouldn't be a present relative to anything.
Right.
Time would just be a series of disconnected random flashes with no sequence. You could have a Tuesday, followed by a 14th century, followed by a Friday.
Which isn't what we experience at all. So if the present can't depend on the past without existing inside it, and it can't not depend on the past, what is time?
Time is a conceptual fabrication. It is a measurement we invent to make sense of the changing web of dependent origination. But time, with a capital T, as a container that events happen inside of, does not exist inherently.
Past, present, and future are entirely relative concepts that only exist in dependence on each other and on the mind that perceives them.
The clash here is monumental. Marx is standing on a soapbox, pointing toward the horizon, commanding us to act.
He says, "We are marching along the timeline of history toward the communist utopia. We must transform the present to build the future."
And Nāgārjuna asks, where is this future you're pointing to? Show it to me.
From a Mūlamadhyamaka perspective, the linear arrow of history simply cannot be established. The very direction of Marxist revolution vanishes into emptiness.
You are trying to move from a present that doesn't inherently exist toward a future that doesn't inherently exist, driven by a chain of cause and effect that is entirely empty.
You know, we all live like Marxists when it comes to time. You listening right now, you probably think that if you work hard today, that's the cause. You will build a better tomorrow. That's the future history.
We definitely live in that linear progression. We obsess over our future selves.
But if time is just an illusion created by our minds stringing together empty, dependent moments, how do we motivate ourselves to act?
Exactly. If history is collapsing, why do anything?
That is the ultimate existential question that arises from this collision, and it leads us directly into the climax of our deep dive, the collision of practice, revolution versus liberation.
Once you understand the world through these frameworks, what are you actually supposed to do with your life?
Let's look at their final prescriptions for human action. Marx's ultimate practical conclusion is immortalized in his 11th thesis on Feuerbach.
Yes. He writes, the philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it.
It is a radical call to external action. The goal is external revolution. Marx demands that we overthrow the material conditions, seize the means of production, dismantle the economic base, and physically restructure the institutions of society.
If the world is causing suffering, you conquer the world.
Now contrast that with Nāgārjuna's ultimate practical conclusion, which we find in chapter 24 of the MMK.
In this chapter, Nāgārjuna defends his philosophy against the accusation that emptiness destroys the Buddha's teachings. He outlines how emptiness actually makes the Four Noble Truths possible.
For Nāgārjuna, understanding emptiness leads to liberation from suffering, which is nirvana.
The goal here isn't to change the external structures of the world. The goal is to let go of fixation. It is to dismantle your internal cognitive attachment to the idea that things, including yourself, your pain, and the society around you, inherently exist.
Look at the exact opposite directions of their prescribed actions. Marx looks outward. He wants to manipulate the material world.
Nāgārjuna looks inward. He wants to deconstruct the cognitive lens through which we view the world.
It is the absolute contrast between changing the world and letting go of the world. Marx says, the system is a cage, let's smash the bars.
Nāgārjuna points out that your very belief that the cage exists inherently, your very grasping at the reality of the bars, is the root of the suffering you are trying to escape.
By trying to violently conquer the cage, you are just tightening the knot of attachment. You are validating the reality of the illusion.
If I can frame this as a choice for you, the listener, imagine you are trapped in a terrifying, incredibly vivid nightmare. A monster is chasing you through a burning city.
Marx is the guy in the dream running next to you, handing you a sword, giving you a detailed manual on the monster's weak points. He's telling you how to organize the other dream characters to build a fortress.
And Nāgārjuna is the voice whispering in your ear, "You are dreaming. The monster is empty. The city is empty. Wake up."
Yes, but I have to push you here. Is Nāgārjuna's approach inherently passive? If you just say, wake up, does letting go of attachment mean ignoring the very real child labor, the exploitation, the starvation that Marx spent his life trying to stop?
That's a fair point.
If you just sit on a meditation cushion realizing emptiness while the factory burns, aren't you letting the capitalists win?
This is the most common and arguably the most vital critique of Eastern philosophy from Western materialists. Does emptiness breed apathy?
Was it?
Nāgārjuna and the broader Mahayana Buddhist tradition would argue fiercely that true realization of emptiness does not lead to apathy. It leads to boundless, unconditional compassion.
But how does realizing everything is empty make you compassionate?
Because when you truly internalize dependent origination, you realize that the boundary between you and the suffering worker is a conceptual fiction.
You are not inherently separate from them.
Exactly. Compassion arises naturally, logically, because their suffering is not separate from your existence. But crucially, this compassion arises without the ego-driven anger, hatred, and rigid tribalism that often fuels violent political revolutions.
So Marx attacks the symptoms of suffering with the weapons of the world, and Nāgārjuna attacks the metaphysical disease that allows the suffering to take root in the mind.
Which brings us to our critical evaluation. Which framework actually serves humanity better? Marx or Nāgārjuna?
Well, we aren't here to declare a simple winner. This isn't a zero-sum game. The goal of placing them side by side is to understand their respective world-altering strengths.
And Marx's strength is undeniable. It works practically against tangible worldly suffering. Exploitation, poverty, wage theft, wealth inequality. These are things we feel in our bones.
Marx provides a concrete, actionable theory for social transformation. He gives us the tools to analyze a global supply chain, to understand why a corporation behaves the way it does, and to organize a union to fight back.
He deals with the mechanics of our daily survival.
But Nāgārjuna's strength operates on an entirely different frequency. It collapses the very premise of the reality that creates the suffering. He dismantles the ontological structure of anxiety from the root.
If you truly internalize emptiness, the crushing anxieties of class, wealth, status, and even death lose their grip on your mind completely, because you see they have no solid core to grasp onto.
So how do we reconcile them? Because they seem completely mutually exclusive. You cannot build a global revolution on a foundation of emptiness, and you cannot achieve spiritual liberation by seizing a steel mill.
This is where we introduce the crucial, brilliant concept from Nāgārjuna's text that ties this entire deep dive together. The two truths doctrine.
The two truths, okay.
In chapter 24, Nāgārjuna explicitly states that the Buddha's teachings rely on two truths: relative or conventional truth, sabbatisatya, and ultimate truth, paramarthasatya.
Okay, break that down for us. What is conventional truth?
Conventional truth is the everyday world of cause and effect, of language, of society, of physical bodies. In the conventional truth, if you drop a ceramic cup, it breaks.
Right. If you work a 14-hour shift in a coal mine, your lungs bleed. If a capitalist extracts surplus value from your labor, you are exploited.
Exactly. The conventional world functions according to dependent origination, and it has real consequences for sentient beings.
And ultimate truth.
Ultimate truth is the realization that everything in the conventional truth is completely empty of inherent existence. The cup, the worker, the dropping, the exploiting the coal mine, none of it has a fixed, independent essence.
It is all a vast, ungraspable web of interdependent phenomena.
Yes.
Oh, this is the ultimate synthesis. These two giants might not be in pure contradiction if we place them on different planes of truth.
Exactly. And this is where we see their true compatibility. Marx is the absolute, undisputed master of the relative truth.
He explains better than almost anyone how the provisional, conventional world of capitalism operates. He maps the matrix perfectly.
He tells you how to live, how to fight, and how to act within the construct to reduce conventional suffering.
And Nāgārjuna holds the ultimate truth. He deconstructs what that reality actually is at a cosmic level. He shows you the code of the matrix and proves it's just empty, dependent data.
The core conclusion of our clash is this. Marx says, the world exists, therefore we must change it. Nāgārjuna says, the view that the world exists inherently is already an attachment that causes suffering.
But through the two truths doctrine, we can see that a complete human being must navigate the conventional world, perhaps using Marxist tools to fight injustice, while simultaneously understanding its ultimate emptiness to prevent becoming consumed by hatred, dogma, or despair.
It's like physics. Think about it. Marx is Newtonian physics. It's solid, it's deterministic, it deals with mass and force.
You absolutely need Newtonian physics to build a suspension bridge or stop a speeding train or organize a global economy. It works perfectly on the macro level of our daily lives.
That is a phenomenal analogy, and Nāgārjuna is quantum physics.
Yes, Nāgārjuna is quantum physics, proving that the speeding train, the steel bridge, and the people standing on it are mostly just empty space and probabilities. None of it is solid at the fundamental level.
You need Newtonian physics to live your daily life and fight for justice, but you need quantum physics to understand the true nature of the universe.
To rely only on the ultimate truth of emptiness while ignoring the conventional suffering of the world is a distortion of Buddhism that leads to fatalism and cold detachment.
But to rely only on the conventional truth of material struggle while ignoring ultimate emptiness leads to burnout, rigid dogmatism, and endless cycles of violent conflict. The middle way is holding both simultaneously.
So what does this mean for you, the listener, as you pull off your headphones and go back to your day? Let's bring all this heavy philosophy back to the surface.
We started this deep dive with Marx's rigid, heavy material structures of capital, labor, and history. We watched Nāgārjuna use the relentless logic of emptiness and the tetralemma to dissolve those structures into provisional names and temporary conditions.
We saw how Marx's demand to physically change the world collides head-on with Nāgārjuna's path of mentally letting go of the world. We watched linear history shatter against the emptiness of time.
And ultimately, we discovered they might just coexist perfectly as the ultimate masters of relative and ultimate truth.
You don't have to choose between fighting for a better world and finding inner peace. You can use Marx's tools to navigate and improve the conventional reality, while using Nāgārjuna's wisdom to keep you from becoming attached to it.
Which leaves us with a profound new way to look at our own lives and our own minds.
And I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over, something that builds on everything we've discussed today. Think about the concept of identity in our modern, hyper-connected world.
We spend our entire lives trying to build a personal brand, a career trajectory, a rigid self.
We try to make ourselves into objective, permanent categories, much like Marx's objective economic classes.
We commodify our very identities, trying to give them an inherent value that we can trade on the social market.
We do, but if Nāgārjuna is right, the harder you try to solidify who you are, the more suffering you create, because you are trying to make permanent something that is inherently empty, constantly changing, and entirely dependent on everything around you.
You are fighting the very nature of reality. The attempt to solidify the self is the ultimate source of alienation.
So tomorrow morning, when you look in the mirror, I want you to ask yourself a terrifying but liberating question. Are you a fixed reality that needs to be aggressively defended, optimized, and capitalized? Or are you just a fleeting, beautifully empty, provisional name?
A vital question for anyone trying to survive in a material world.
Thank you for joining us on this incredibly deep dive, exploring these massively different perspectives, holding contradictory truths in your mind simultaneously, and finding the synthesis between them. That is the true shortcut to being deeply well-informed. Until next time, keep questioning the foundation.